The walls of that hotel room seemed to compress the air as I stood in front of the half-open door. On the other side, her voice echoed low, intimate, accompanied by muffled laughter that left no room for doubt. For a moment, I wanted to believe that it was just a misunderstanding, that nervous laugh came from a phone call, from a harmless conversation. But no. The male murmur that responded to her erased any remaining hope. My heart was pounding so loudly that I could barely hear it as the elevator door closed behind me. My fingers held the folder where I kept the divorce letter, and it was as heavy as lead. The folded paper, the signature at the end, each word carefully chosen during sleepless nights, everything there was about to be delivered as a final sentence. I could have left. I could have left that hotel and handled everything differently, but something pulled me into that hallway. Maybe it was hurt pride, maybe it was the desperate need to see her react, to look into the eyes of the woman I thought I knew better than anyone else in the world. When I knocked on the door, there was no immediate response. Seconds later, she opened just enough for her eyes to meet mine. The shock in his expression hit me like a punch. She tried to close the door, but I was faster. I pushed, went in, and that's when I saw him. The man who until that moment existed only as a possibility became flesh, bones and reality. He was there, sitting on the bed with the sheet pulled up to his waist, staring at me with the kind of surprise only a guilty person feels when caught. I didn't say anything at first. I just placed the folded letter on the table next to the bed. She took it with shaking hands, her eyes darting from line to line as the man still tried to cover himself with the sheet. When she got to the end and saw my signature, the color drained from her face. It was then that the words began to come out, quick, desperate, disorganized. She tried to explain, she tried to deny it, she tried to convince me that it didn't mean anything. But how could it not? The crumpled sheets, the clothes scattered on the floor, his scent permeating the air, none of it was irrelevant. Every detail was a confession, a silent testimony that everything I had built with her had been thrown away. I didn't need to hear anything else. He was determined, certain that he would leave that room and never look back. But then, something happened. As I turned to leave, the hotel phone rang, interrupting her sobs. The man hurriedly got up to answer, and the moment he uttered the name that echoed on the other end of the line, I knew. The name he said, a familiar, intimate name, was like a knife ripping through everything I was still trying to keep intact. He wasn't just any lover. He was not a stranger who infiltrated our lives. It was someone who should be far away, someone who had too deep ties to us for this to be just a common betrayal. She tried to snatch the phone from his hand, but it was too late. My gaze met hers, and in that instant, I realized that I no longer knew who the woman standing in front of me was. Every night shared, every plan for the future, every moment of vulnerability I had surrendered, it all now seemed part of a carefully engineered illusion. I wanted answers, I wanted to understand how it had started, what had led her there, but the only thing I could feel was the need to escape before the anger took over. She ran after me into the hallway, pulling on my arm, begging me to listen, to not give up. The lover appeared right behind, still trying to put on his shirt, as if he could compose himself in the face of the chaos he helped create. I glared at him, and he looked away, but not before I noticed something that completely changed the way I viewed the situation. There was a familiarity in his gestures, in his nervousness, as if he, too, was involved in something much bigger than a simple case. She knew it, I could see it in her eyes, but what I didn't know at that moment was how much it would unfold into something even darker. The divorce letter was still on the table when I left the room, but nothing that night ended there. The secrets that began to emerge after that moment transformed everything. Their relationship was more than a passing fling, more than lust or fling. There was something deeper, something that pushed me into an abyss I wasn't prepared to face. Every piece of information I discovered made me question not only who she was, but also who I had been throughout my time with her. And at the center of it all, was that name, that phone call, that unexpected connection that promised to unearth wounds I didn't even know existed. As I walked down the hotel stairs, her words still echoed in my mind. It's not what you think. But how could it not be? How could it be anything other than what my eyes had witnessed? I left that hotel believing that I had seen everything, that the worst was over. But I was wrong. The next morning, an anonymous envelope arrived at my house, and inside it was something that completely changed the course of my decision. Something that made me question whether divorce would be enough punishment for what she had done. Something that forced me to return to the same hotel, the same room, only to discover that that story was far from over. Welcome to the channel, where we reveal the most intense and emotional dramas about love and betrayal. Here, we do not and will never support any type of infidelity. Our stories are fictional, but they reflect the real and devastating consequences that betrayal can have on people's lives. Get ready to dive into a shocking narrative, full of twists and emotions. Sit back and enjoy, you're about to hear a story that will touch every fiber of your being. The sun slowly dipped below the horizon, turning the sky gold and orange as cars piled into the 6 o'clock traffic. In a discreet but elegant building, Ethan finished reviewing a contract on his impeccably organized desk. He twirled the ring on his finger, a habit he had acquired over the past few months, and let out a sigh before leaning back in the leather chair. As much as he tried to ignore it, there was a growing restlessness inside him, as if something was slightly out of place, but he always explained it away as tiredness. Years of hard work have led him to this point, a stable position, a spacious home, and a seemingly perfect life with Olivia, his wife. They had been together for over a decade, and he often said that their marriage was proof that love could stand the test of time, as long as it was nurtured with patience, dedication, and occasional little surprises. Olivia had always been the balance between routine and the unexpected. She was the type of woman who knew how to mix simplicity and sophistication, charming with subtle gestures. Her green eyes, intense and expressive, were a window into a world Ethan loved to explore. They met at a corporate event and, from the first look they exchanged, there was an instant connection. At the time, Ethan was deep into his career, and Olivia had emerged as a breath of new life. Their relationship grew quickly but unhurriedly, full of long conversations, late dinners and plans for the future. He remembered her smile on their wedding day, radiant beneath the white veil, and how he thought this would be the beginning of a life without doubts or regrets. In the first few years, everything was exactly as he imagined. The weekend trips, the impromptu dinners on the porch, the renovation plans that never got off the ground. They laughed, fought and made up, like any couple in love. Olivia quit her job to open a small interior design studio, something she always dreamed of, and Ethan supported her from the beginning. He knew her talent was authentic and he was sure the business would work. And it did. Soon, Olivia began to gain important clients, and her nights began to be divided between her projects and his reports. They were busy but happy. Or at least that was how Ethan saw things. Over time, however, signs began to appear, albeit discreetly. Ethan noticed that Olivia was becoming increasingly engrossed in work, answering messages late at night and canceling dinners. He didn't complain, because he understood the effort it takes to stay competitive, but there were times when he missed her attention. Sometimes he would catch himself watching her as she worked on her laptop, lost in thought. He wondered if she still saw him the same way, if she still felt that shiver when he touched her. When these thoughts arose, he quickly dismissed them, convincing himself that they were just baseless paranoia. After all, Olivia has always been loyal, caring and dedicated. He had no real reason to doubt her. The house they shared also seemed to carry fragments of a story he couldn't decipher. The plush sofa where they watched movies now seemed emptier, even when they were sitting side by side. The dining table, once the center of conversation and laughter, had become a silent space, filled with quick meals and sporadic glances at the cell phone. Ethan noticed that Olivia's scents changed. Previously soft and floral, they were now striking and seductive. When he asked about the change, she laughed and said she needed to try something new. He smiled in response, but felt an uncomfortable pang that refused to go away. Despite silent doubts, Ethan worked hard to keep the relationship alive. He planned a surprise trip for her birthday, bought flowers for no apparent reason and went back to preparing Friday dinner, an old habit they had lost. Olivia reacted with gratitude, but her responses seemed rehearsed, as if she were trying to respond to something she no longer felt. He tried not to care. After all, marriages go through phases, and maybe this was just one of them. On the weekends, Ethan began to notice that Olivia was more absent. She said she needed to visit clients, monitor projects, or look for materials, and he always believed her. But there was something about the way she dressed herself that made him wonder if those appointments were really that professional. The tight dresses, the high heels that she rarely wore before, and the impeccable makeup for a simple meeting aroused an discomfort that he tried to ignore. One night, while Olivia was out, Ethan found her tablet on the table and, on impulse, unlocked it. There was nothing compromising, just ordinary messages and work emails, but the absence of anything suspicious made him even more uneasy. It was as if everything was too tidy, organized so as not to leave a trace. He hated feeling paranoid, but he also couldn't shake that feeling. Olivia, for her part, also seemed to be struggling with something. There were moments when she was more affectionate than usual, as if trying to compensate for an invisible guilt. At others, she was distant, immersed in thoughts that Ethan couldn't reach. He began to wonder if, in some way, he had failed her. Perhaps he had been too absorbed by work, goals and routine, forgetting to pay attention to the details that previously came naturally. That particular night, while Olivia left for another work appointment, Ethan was left alone in the living room, staring at his phone and fighting the urge to call her. He knew he needed to trust that their love was strong enough to weather any storm. But when he heard the sound of a notification on her cell phone, which he had forgotten at home, his stomach dropped. He looked at the screen, saw the name that appeared and knew, in that instant, that something was about to change forever. He turned off his cell phone screen, took a deep breath and tried to calm his thoughts. After all, it could just be a misunderstanding. It could be a coincidence, an innocent situation that his mind was turning into a bigger problem. But even though he tried to convince himself of this, something inside him knew that the answers he was looking for were closer than he wanted. Ethan woke up that morning with the strange feeling that something was out of place. The side of the bed where Olivia usually lay was already empty, the sheet neatly folded, with no sign that she had ever been there. He stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the last few weeks piling up on his shoulders, and went to the kitchen. The coffee maker was still running, but the coffee had already cooled, indicating that she had left early. The hurried note left on the counter simply said that he had an important meeting and would be back late. Ethan read and reread those few words, feeling an uneasiness come over him. He tried to convince himself that it was just another busy day, that there was no reason to worry, but something inside him couldn't quite believe it. He tried to focus on work throughout the day, but his thoughts kept coming back to Olivia. The constant excuses to go out, the irregular hours, the automatic smiles that seemed to cover something deeper. He knew that a marriage couldn't survive without trust, but what bothered him was the feeling that she was hiding something, and it wasn't small. At the end of the afternoon, after checking his cell phone for the 10th time looking for a message, Ethan decided he needed answers. He wasn't about to spend another night tormented by doubts. He got in the car and drove aimlessly, as if the movement could calm his thoughts, but with each corner he covered, the feeling that he was about to discover something irreversible grew. When he parked in front of the building where Olivia said she was having a meeting, he stood for a few minutes, watching the entrance. It was a discreet commercial building, but the luxury cars parked out front suggested that it was something much more exclusive than she had described. Ethan decided to wait. The minutes dragged by, and he began to wonder if he was overreacting, if he shouldn't just go home and trust her. But then, he saw Olivia leave the building. She was different. The tight dress, high heels, and perfectly coiffed hair didn't match what he expected from someone leaving a business meeting. She seemed ready for a date, and the discreet smile she gave the man accompanying her confirmed the suspicions he was trying to deny. Ethan felt his stomach drop as the two walked to a car parked on the corner. He followed the car without thinking much about what he was doing. At every traffic light, his mind replayed the past few months, looking for signs he might have ignored. The image of Olivia smiling at that man burned in his memory, making him increasingly uneasy. When the car stopped in front of an inconspicuous hotel, Ethan needed a few seconds to process what was happening. He watched as the two went down and entered together, exchanging looks that left no room for doubt. The pain he felt was almost physical, as if something inside him had been ripped away. Still, instead of leaving, he got out of the car and followed them. The hotel hallway was silent, interrupted only by the muffled sound of voices coming from the rooms. Ethan stopped in front of the door he had seen Olivia enter and stood there for a moment, trying to muster the courage to do what he knew needed to be done. He knocked once, then another. He heard whispers on the other side, hurried footsteps, and then the door opened. Olivia was there, and the shock in her eyes confirmed everything. Before she could say anything, Ethan pushed the door open and entered. The man was in bed, trying to cover himself with the sheet, and the sight made Ethan's blood boil. Olivia stepped forward, raising her hands as if to stop him from doing something thoughtless, but he just placed an envelope on the table and stood there, waiting. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers, quickly reading the words before stopping at the signature at the end. Desperation took over her instantly. The words began to come out, fast and disorganized, but Ethan could barely hear them. Everything seemed muffled, as if he was watching the scene from afar. The man tried to explain himself, but Ethan ignored him. He wasn't there to argue, to fight or to beg for explanations. I was there to end something that had already ended long before that moment. When Ethan finally left the room, he felt the weight of that discovery transform into something denser, heavier. He knew this wasn't the end, because something about the man seemed disturbingly familiar. The voice, the way he avoided looking directly at Ethan, as if he carried an even greater guilt than just sleeping with Olivia. But at that moment, Ethan didn't want to think about that. He walked down the hotel stairs feeling as if each step took him deeper into something he still didn't fully understand. Back in the car, he sat for a long time, looking at the steering wheel and trying to collect his thoughts. The images of that room kept coming back, over and over, but there was something beyond that. Something he still couldn't explain, but he knew was important. Olivia tried to call him several times, but he ignored every call. I knew that, sooner or later, I would have to face her again, but at that moment I needed space. I needed to think. As he drove through the city, Olivia's words echoed in his mind. She said there was an explanation, that he didn't know everything, but how could there be anything that justified what he had seen? He felt anger, pain, and a suffocating sense of betrayal, but he also felt something else. Something deeper, darker, that he still couldn't name. He knew he couldn't just let it go, because there were questions that still needed answers. And those answers could change everything. Ethan stood in front of the closed door of the apartment he knew so well. It was the home of an old friend, someone who had attended her dinner parties, toasted Olivia's success and participated in conversations that seemed trivial at the time, but now took on a completely different meaning. The image of him sitting on the hotel bed was still vivid in Ethan's mind, like an open wound that refused to heal. Anger pulsed in his chest, but there was something stronger than that, an almost desperate need to understand. He knocked on the door once, then again, until he heard footsteps approaching. When the door opened, the man's face was marked with nervousness. Before he could even say anything, Ethan entered, closing the door behind him. The man took a step back, trying to maintain a defensive posture, but his expression betrayed fear. Ethan crossed his arms and waited. The silence between the two stretched for seconds that seemed eternal until the man finally broke the silence. He said it wasn't what it seemed, but his voice trailed off mid-sentence, as if he knew any justification would sound hollow. Ethan narrowed his eyes, moving closer, and demanded that he tell the truth. When the man hesitated, Ethan pushed him against the wall, his tone low and sharp. He asked how long this had been going on, but before he got an answer, he heard the door open behind him. Olivia came in, panting, as if she had run up the stairs. Her eyes were wide at the sight of them together, and she let out a "no," almost desperate before running over to Ethan and grabbing his arm. She asked him to get out of there, to talk somewhere else, but Ethan ignored her. He broke free and pointed at the man, demanding that she tell him everything. Olivia started crying, saying it wasn't as simple as it seemed. Ethan shouted that nothing there was simple, that everything was already destroyed, and that was when Olivia collapsed. Between sobs, he confessed that this man was not just someone he had gotten involved with. He was someone from the past, someone Ethan also knew well. The shock made Ethan take a step back, as if he had been struck. He looked at the man and then back at Olivia, trying to put together the pieces of a puzzle that seemed to come apart in his hands. Olivia said they had a history, something that happened before she met Ethan but was never really resolved. He said he met him again by chance months ago and that it all started with innocent conversations, memories that seemed harmless but quickly turned into something more. Ethan couldn't believe what he was hearing. The idea that the man he invited to his home, who he considered a friend, was someone Olivia had shared an intimate past with made his head spin. But it was what came next that made him completely lose control. Olivia kept talking, as if she finally couldn't hold back the words any longer. She revealed that the man, named Daniel, was not just an ex-lover. He was someone who knew a secret about her, something she never had the courage to tell Ethan. Ethan's eyes narrowed, and he demanded she explain. Olivia hesitated, but then, in a shaky voice, said that Daniel knew something that could destroy not only their marriage, but Ethan's career as well. Said he had discovered that some of the money invested in the design company came from a source Ethan would never accept, an illegal loan that Olivia took out without telling him. Ethan was silent, trying to process. He felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under his feet. He asked if she was saying that Daniel was blackmailing her, but Olivia shook her head and said that, at first, it wasn't like that. She confessed that she sought out Daniel because she knew he had contacts who could help her get the money quickly and discreetly. But after the debt was paid, Daniel began to appear more and more in her life, offering support and attention, until everything spiraled out of control. Ethan looked at the man, seeing him differently now. Not as an ordinary lover, but as someone who deliberately infiltrated their lives, manipulating Olivia's insecurities and fears. The anger returned with full force. Ethan lunged at Daniel, grabbing him by the shirt and pushing him against the wall. He said he knew exactly the kind of man he was, a parasite who preyed on other people's weaknesses. Daniel tried to defend himself, saying that Olivia had looked for him, that he wasn't the one who started it, but Ethan didn't want to hear it. Olivia yelled for him to stop, but Ethan let go of Daniel only to turn to her. He asked her why she hadn't trusted him, why she thought she needed to hide something so big. Olivia tried to explain, saying she was afraid of disappointing him, of destroying everything they had built. He said he never planned for things to get to this point, but by the time he realized it, it was too late. Ethan felt the impact of her words like stab wounds. As furious as he was, as much as he wanted to hate her, he couldn't ignore the desperation in her eyes. But he also knew he couldn't just forget what she had done. He said he needed some time, that he needed to think, and left the apartment without looking back. As I walked through the streets, my heart felt heavy and my mind was confused. He didn't know if he could forgive her, but he knew the truth had changed everything. Their marriage would never be the same, and he would need to decide if he was willing to fight for it or if it was time to leave everything behind. Ethan walked the streets aimlessly, feeling the weight of the last few hours sinking him into a suffocating silence. The steps were hurried, but his mind was slow, turning over every word said in the apartment. Olivia's revelations echoed like thunder that refused to go away. He stopped in an empty park, resting his hands on his knees to try to catch his breath, but the lump in his throat made it harder. She needed to think, she needed to understand, but each thought led to the same question: how was she able to? The phone rang in his pocket, interrupting his reverie. He hesitated before answering. It was Olivia. Her voice sounded hoarse, filled with despair. I said I needed to see him, that I needed to finish the conversation. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, fighting the urge to shut down, but he knew running away wouldn't solve anything. He said where he was and waited. Minutes later, she appeared. His face was pale, his eyes red and swollen, as if he hadn't stopped crying since he left. She stopped a few steps away, as if waiting for permission to approach. When he didn't say anything, she inched forward, sitting next to him on the bench. She started by apologizing, but Ethan raised his hand, cutting her off. I didn't want excuses, I wanted answers. He asked her how it started, when exactly she decided that hiding something so big was better than trusting him. Olivia lowered her head, hands shaking in her lap. She said that it all started with a project that went wrong, an investment that promised a quick return, but ended up costing more than she could afford. She said she didn't know how to tell him because she knew he would judge her for making decisions without consulting him. Ethan clenched his fists, trying to control his rising anger. She continued, explaining that when she realized she was in trouble, she reached out to Daniel because she knew he had connections that could help her. He said the money solved the problem, but he brought another one. Daniel began to appear in her life with excuses and promises, and she, weakened, let him get closer than he should have. She said it was all a mistake, that she never wanted to hurt him, but that, when she realized it, she was already trapped in the web of lies. Ethan fell silent, letting her words hit him like invisible punches. He asked her if she loved him, if there was still something true between them. Olivia looked up, and the pain in her gaze was so evident that Ethan felt his chest tighten. She said that she always loved him, that she never stopped loving him, but that fear and guilt made her act impulsively. He said he lost himself in the process, trying to fix something that only got worse. He stood up abruptly, moving away from her. He needed air, space, but Olivia followed him, begging him to listen to her. She said she was willing to do anything to save the marriage, that the money had already been paid, that Daniel no longer had anything against them. But Ethan knew it wasn't that simple. Even if the financial problem was resolved, the marks that remained would not disappear so easily. It was then that Olivia said something that made him stop. He said there was more, something she hadn't told him because she thought she would never need to. Ethan turned around slowly, looking at her with a mix of tiredness and irritation. He asked what else there could be, what else she had hidden. Olivia hesitated, but then revealed that Daniel had recorded compromising conversations between the two and that he used them to threaten her when she tried to end things. He said he didn't just want the money, I wanted control. Ethan felt the anger rising again, but this time it was mixed with something else, a desire to protect Olivia, despite everything. He asked why she didn't tell him earlier, why she didn't ask for help. Olivia said she was scared, that she thought she could resolve it herself, but that when she saw Ethan at the hotel, she realized she had lost everything. Before he could respond, Olivia's phone rang. She answered with her hands shaking, and the voice on the other end made her face lose all color. Ethan walked over, taking the phone from her hand. On the other side, Daniel spoke calmly, as if nothing had happened. He said he knew where they were, that Olivia owed them an explanation, and that if she didn't come back to resolve everything, he was ready to expose the recordings. Ethan gripped the phone tightly, telling Daniel that it ended there. He said he knew exactly what kind of man he was and that if he tried anything he would pay dearly for it. Daniel laughed defiantly and hung up. Olivia started to cry again, but Ethan held her face, forcing her to look at him. He said she needed to be strong, that she wouldn't let Daniel destroy anything else. He said that, despite everything, they would face it together. Olivia nodded, but the fear in her eyes was evident. They went to Daniel's apartment that night. Ethan knocked on the door loudly, and when Daniel opened it, he looked surprised but not scared. Ethan entered uninvited, pushing Daniel back. He said he wanted the recordings, that he wanted everything erased, or he would call the police. Daniel smiled, saying they had no evidence against him, but Ethan was faster. He showed the messages and recordings from his own cell phone, evidence that Daniel didn't know Ethan had collected after the incident at the hotel. Daniel tried to argue, but Ethan made it clear that there was no room for negotiation. He said that if he didn't delete everything right then, he would hand the material over to the police and Daniel's wife, who, according to information collected by Ethan, also knew nothing about his activities. Daniel hesitated, but saw in Ethan's eyes that he was serious. Under pressure, he deleted the files and handed over his cell phone for Ethan to check. Olivia watched in silence, holding back tears as she watched Daniel's control over her crumble. When they left the apartment, Ethan felt a weight lift off his shoulders, but he knew this was just the beginning. Olivia held his hand, thanking him through tears, but Ethan didn't respond. There was still a lot to be resolved between them. Forgiveness wouldn't come easy, and he knew it would take time for him to trust her again, if at all. As they drove back home, Olivia asked if there was still hope for them. Ethan was silent for a long time before saying he didn't know. He said he loved the woman she was, but he wasn't sure he could love the woman she had become. She held his hand tightly, promising that she would do everything to rebuild what they had lost. Ethan didn't respond. He knew her words were sincere, but in that moment, all he could feel was the emptiness left by what had been destroyed. Ethan drove down the road in silence, streetlights passing like figures along the way. Olivia sat next to him, motionless, her eyes fixed on the window as if the darkness outside could offer some kind of comfort. The car was weighed down by an invisible weight, carrying not only the wear and tear of the last few hours, but also the scars of years of trust being slowly eroded without him realizing it. Ethan kept his hands firmly on the steering wheel, but his knuckles felt stiff, as if all the accumulated tension was concentrated there. He tried to organize his thoughts, but each memory of the conversation in Daniel's apartment came like a snap, tearing apart any attempt to find clarity. The fear in Olivia's eyes, the faltering words, the apologies that seemed genuine but didn't erase what had happened. Ethan felt like he was caught between two worlds, one where he still saw her as the woman he loved, and another where she was just the person who betrayed him, lied to him, and begged for forgiveness too late. Olivia broke the silence, her voice weak and wavering. She said she knew he no longer trusted her, but that she needed to believe there was something between them that could be saved. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He kept his eyes on the road, trying to control his tone before speaking. He said he didn't know what he felt, that her betrayal was not just physical, but emotional. He said that what destroyed him most was not his involvement with Daniel, but the fact that he turned to him instead of asking for help. She turned to him, her eyes teary, and tried to argue that she was scared, that she didn't want to disappoint him, but Ethan cut her off. She said that everyone is afraid, that everyone faces difficult times, but that she chose to deal with it by hiding, lying and, worse, getting involved with someone who knew exactly how to manipulate her. He asked her if she thought he wouldn't understand, if she thought he would turn his back on her. Olivia was silent, unable to respond. The car stopped in front of their house, and Olivia hesitated before opening the door. Ethan left first, leaving her behind as he crossed the dark room and dropped his keys on the table. His chest felt tight, like he was about to explode, but at the same time, he was too exhausted to scream. Olivia came in soon after, pausing in the doorway as if she wasn't sure if she should approach. He looked at her and saw the woman who had once been everything to him, but he also saw the shadows of what she had done. She finally came over, sitting down on the couch and starting to talk. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, but she needed him to know it wasn't easy for her. She said Daniel made her feel vulnerable but at the same time needed, as if he had found a quick solution to a problem that could have destroyed her dream. She said she hated to admit it, but for a moment she liked the attention, she liked feeling wanted, something she hadn't felt in a while. Ethan closed his eyes, trying not to explode at those words. He knew their marriage had gone through rough patches, but hearing that she sought comfort from another man made him feel helpless. When she opened her eyes again, Ethan asked her if she really understood what she had done, if she understood how much it destroyed him. Olivia said yes, she was sorry, but she was also willing to rebuild everything, even though she knew it might take time. Ethan got up, pacing the room as if trying to find some lost answer among the furniture. He said he didn't know if he could look at her without remembering what happened, that he might never be able to trust her like he used to. Olivia begged him not to give up, saying she still loved him and would do anything to prove it. She said she knew she needed time, but she was willing to wait. Ethan laughed, but it was a bitter laugh, filled with pain. He asked her how long she thought it would take to erase everything, to make him forget the nights he wondered where she was, the messages she deleted, the moments she pretended to love him while she was involved with another man. She started crying again, but Ethan continued. He said the problem wasn't just the betrayal, but the ease with which she let herself be carried away. She said she couldn't stop imagining the moments they shared and wondering if, at some point, she thought about him. Olivia said she thought, that she felt guilty, but Ethan shook his head. He said that guilt wasn't enough, that regret after the fact didn't erase the choices made. Olivia stood up, walking over to him and holding his hands. She said she knew words weren't enough, but she was willing to prove in every way possible that she still loved him. She said that what happened to Daniel was not about love, but about fragility, about being lost. Ethan looked into her eyes, and for a moment, he saw the woman he fell in love with. But that image disappeared quickly, replaced by memories of the hotel room, the messages, the lies. He let go of her hands and took a step back. He said he needed space, he needed to think without her being around. Olivia tried to argue, but he was firm. He said he wasn't saying it was the end, but he also couldn't promise there would be a new beginning. He said he needed to find a place where he could breathe without feeling the weight of everything that had happened. Olivia nodded, wiping away her tears, but before he left, she said something that stopped him in his tracks. He said that, despite everything, she still believed in them, that she wouldn't give up until he said, in so many words, that there was no more chance. Ethan didn't respond. He grabbed his keys and left, feeling the cold night air hit his face as he tried to ignore the feeling that something inside him had been shattered beyond repair. He drove for hours, aimlessly, stopping only when fatigue made it impossible to continue. Sitting in the car, staring into space, he realized he was faced with an impossible dilemma: move forward and try to rebuild something that had been destroyed, or accept that some things cannot be fixed. And as the night wore on, he knew that whatever he decided, nothing would be the same as before. Ethan returned home after 2 days away. I was exhausted, but I knew that final conversation was inevitable. Olivia was sitting on the couch when he entered. Her face seemed paler, her eyes marked by sleepless nights. She stood up as soon as she saw him and tried to say something, but he raised his hand asking her to wait. Ethan walked into the living room, placed the keys on the table and sat in the armchair opposite her. There was something in his gaze that Olivia recognized immediately: a decision had been made. She stood for a moment, as if waiting for one last chance, but when he spoke, his voice was firm and unwavering. He said he had spent the last few days trying to find a reason to continue, trying to justify her mistakes and even his own. He said he looked at their past, at the good times, but in the end, he always came back to the same place. He said their love was no longer enough to erase the scars left by lies and betrayal. Olivia started to cry, but Ethan continued. He said he could no longer live in a relationship where trust had been destroyed and where respect had been set aside so many times. He said that she made decisions that put them in that situation and that, as much as he wanted to forgive her, he simply couldn't forget. Olivia fell onto the couch, covering her face with her hands, begging him to reconsider, but Ethan shook his head. He said he wasn't willing to spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, wondering if it would happen again. He said that divorce was the only way out for both of them. She stood up and walked over, cupping his face with her shaking hands. She told him she loved him, that she was willing to do anything to make up for what she had done, but Ethan slowly pushed her hands away. He said he knew she was sorry, but that regret didn't change what happened. Olivia fell to her knees, asking for one more chance, but he walked away, picked up the bags he had left at the door and left. Olivia was left behind, alone in the empty room, feeling the weight of the choices she had made. Months later, Ethan was sitting in a cafe, reviewing documents while trying to reorganize his life. The divorce had been made official and, although he still felt the emotional impact, he was beginning to see a different future. Olivia tried to get in touch a few times, but he kept his distance. I knew that in order to move forward, I needed to step away completely. While reviewing the paperwork, a woman approached, asking permission to sit at the next table. Ethan looked up and recognized her immediately. It was Emma, Daniel's wife. She seemed stronger than the last time they saw each other, but there was a weight in her eyes that Ethan knew well. She asked how he was, and he smiled, saying he was trying to rebuild himself. She nodded, saying she was doing the same. She said that she had divorced Daniel after finding out more about his lies and manipulations. She said she felt relieved, but also scared, as if she had to relearn how to live alone. Ethan felt an unexpected connection to those words. They talked for hours, sharing stories and feelings, and when night came, Ethan offered to walk her to the car. As they walked, he felt something different. For the first time in a long time, he felt hope. Olivia, on the other hand, was struggling to get back on her feet. The design studio she worked so hard to build lost clients after rumors about the scandal with Daniel. She tried to rebuild her professional reputation, but the weight of the past continued to haunt her. He spent months in therapy, trying to understand why he made the decisions he did and how he could avoid repeating the same mistakes. There were times when she thought about looking for Ethan again, but she knew he had moved on. She heard from friends that he was seeing someone and decided to leave him alone, even though it hurt more than she could bear. Daniel, in turn, was not so lucky. After losing his job due to misconduct, he was sued by customers who discovered his fraud and ended up facing legal problems. His reputation was destroyed, and he began to live on side jobs, trying to escape the consequences of his actions. Without support and abandoned by those who once surrounded him, he became a shadow of the manipulative man he once was. Olivia learned from a third party that he had left town and had no plans to return. As much as she hated him, she felt sorry for him, seeing in him a dark reflection of what her own life could have been if she hadn't tried to change. Ethan continued to see Emma, and over time, their relationship evolved from a friendship based on shared pain to something deeper. She brought lightness to his life, and he offered the stability she sought. Still, Ethan carried scars from the past. He knew he would never forget what happened to Olivia, but he also knew that it had changed him. He became more attentive, more careful, and promised himself that he would never ignore the warning signs again. Each of their lives followed different paths, marked by the choices they made and the consequences they faced. Olivia learned that the price of betrayal is higher than she imagined. Daniel paid with his own freedom and reputation, and Ethan discovered that, even after pain, it is possible to find a new beginning. But the scars remained, reminding them every day that choices made in the heat of the moment can echo forever. If you liked this story, leave your comment telling us what you thought and share your opinion about the characters. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. And remember, this channel does not support cheating of any kind. The consequences are real and can destroy lives. Until the next story.